Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Chapman University. This is a panel discussion. What did Richard Nixon think? A realist perspective of the world. We're very pleased and honored to be sharing the podium today with scholars from the Nixon Center in Washington, D.C. And this event is being co-sponsored by the Center for Global Education and Wilkinson College here at Chapman University, and by the Nixon Foundation. I'd like to introduce Sandy Quinn, the Executive Director of the Nixon Foundation.
Thank you. I am with the foundation part of the Nixon Library, and I hope if I asked how many of you have been to the Nixon Library, which is about 10 minutes away in Yorba Linda, that most all of you would raise your hands. But I'll be back in a few months to ask you, and I hope that all of you will have raised your hands by then. Now, what is the Nixon Foundation? It's a nonprofit that supports the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum, which runs the galleries and maintains all of the papers of the presidency, which are now housed at the Nixon Library. And unlike most presidential libraries around the country, and there are 13 of them total, the Richard Nixon Presidential Library has the original birthplace, built in 1912 by Richard Nixon's father, Frank, and he was born there in 1913, so it's his birthplace, and just a few feet away are the memorial sites, the burial grounds of President and Mrs. Nixon. And just a few feet away from that are the galleries where you can experience the life of Richard Nixon through displays and videos and artifacts, and even in the birthplace you'll find all the original furniture, the bed he was born in, the piano that he learned to play music on, the violin that he learned to play. And thanks to some family members with foresight, they saved all of this, and it is there as a wonderful artifact of the humble beginnings of Orange County and that period of time. So Richard Nixon to you is not only the 37th president, but he's an Orange Countyan. He was born in Yorba Linda, went to school at Whittier, and spent many years here in residence. Came back here after leaving the White House, going to Casa Pacifica, which, if you saw Frost Nixon, the movie, it was heavily used in that because that's where he spent several years after leaving the White House. He also used it as the Western White House during his presidency when he would come out and spend a month or so or whatever, and there were executive offices all surrounding it, and that's where they ran the affairs of business. It's healthy for a president to get out of the White House now and then. So he's a neighbor, and went on to be president. So I was having breakfast with Jim Doty last year, and we both thought we should do some things together. So the real mission of the Nixon Foundation is to extend the legacy of Richard Nixon, to talk about the things that he accomplished. His signature things that people know about, of course, are foreign affairs, the opening of China. But there's an enormous menu of accomplishments and initiatives in domestic affairs as well. Today's focus is on foreign affairs, and we have friends from our Nixon Center in Washington you'll hear more about an introduction from Jim in a few minutes. But I thank you for coming, and I thank you for letting the Nixon Foundation and the Nixon Center join with Chapman University in putting on a program that I hope you enjoy. Thank you.
I'm Dr. James Coyle. I'm the director of the Center for Global Education here at Chapman University. I'm also the program director of the Master of Arts in International Studies. I don't have much of a role in today except to introduce your speakers. I will begin with our first speaker, Geoffrey Kemp, Director of Regional Strategic Programs at the Nixon Center in Washington, D.C. He served in the White House during the first Reagan administration as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs on the National Security Staff. Dr. Kemp received his Ph.D. in Political Science at MIT, and he earned his M.A. and his B.A. degrees from Oxford University. Dr. Kemp.
Jim, thank you very much indeed, and Sandy for bringing us out here to this gorgeous setting. It has been raining solidly in Washington since 3 a.m. this morning, and will continue, I think, through the night. I think what we're meant to do here this afternoon is try to speculate a little bit about what Richard Nixon might think of several of the key foreign policy issues that face the nation today. And what I'm going to try to do is to talk about one area which he was certainly extremely interested in and engaged in, namely the Middle East. And then my colleagues Paul and Drew will respectively talk about Russia and China. It's interesting to note that this morning before we came here, we had the most marvelous tour of the foundation and the library, and on one of the walls where they have a collection of the notes Richard Nixon took while he was president are notes he made on a pad in January 1972 about what the priorities should be for the next administration. Okay, his next administration, assuming he got reelected. And the first set of issues was foreign policy. And it's fascinating that the first three items on Nixon's list in 72 were first, Russia - the SALT Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, China, engage, Middle East, a settlement. And it's uncanny that I would bet if you go to the White House today, the current president, and ask him what his priorities are going to be for the next year after the midterms, you would find Russia, START Treaty, China, continue to engage, Middle East, a settlement. So, I mean, my point's very simple, that the key issues that we face today are, in their own way, very similar to those that were faced back in 1972 and the 70s. Now, in the case of the Middle East, there's absolutely no doubt that this is a high priority for the United States and has been really since the mid-60s when we became deeply involved in the security of Israel. I think you would find, if you made a trip to the Middle East today, that in both Israel and Egypt, Nixon is still highly regarded. In the case of Israel, because it was the Nixon administration that authorized the resupply of Israel during the critical hours of the 1973 October War. And Egypt, he was highly welcomed because of his contribution, aided, of course, by Dr. Kissinger, in bringing about the first steps towards reconciliation between the United States and Egypt and Israel. If you look at the Middle East today, the sort of challenges that Obama and we all face, there are three quick problems I want to address. First, Iraq. Second, Iran. And third, Arab Israel. Now, and I'm going to try to quickly, in shorthand, summarize what I think the key debates and conflicts are about our policy and try to weave some interpretation of what Nixon might think about it. Now, there's no doubt that the war we launched against Iraq in 2003 was generated by 9/11. That I think is accepted. what is much more controversial is not so much that we ultimately went to war with Saddam Hussein, but what we did after we had overthrown him. Because if you think back to the great debate in 2002 and early 2003, essentially the key reason the Bush administration argued we needed to overthrow Saddam Hussein was because 9/11 had pointed to the fact that terrorism could be a direct threat to our national security, and that Saddam Hussein was known to be close to terrorist groups, although they'd never exactly blamed him for 9/11. They did not blame him for 9/11. But they felt that Saddam Hussein in the possession of nuclear weapons would be an unacceptable threat to the United States, to the region, and to sort of global security, particularly since Iraq sits, in the middle of the largest proven oil reserves in the world. And so therefore the initial premise behind 2003 was, I would say, based on at the time, very sort of perceived to be realistic assumption about the threats posed by Saddam and nuclear weapons. Now, of course, it turned out that there were no nuclear weapons. And very quickly, the administration's justification for the war, which became the sort of the headline, was that we're not just there to get rid of Saddam Hussein and his nuclear capability. We are there to transform the Middle East. That by changing the government of Iraq and putting in a new government, nurturing democracy in Iraq, it will have a domino effect and spread throughout the region, and other dictatorships will soon get the message, and we will then have a new era of pro-American governments who will make peace with Israel. And that, in very simplified language, was what the great hope was of many of the people who supported the war. And that, I would argue, was where idealism and ideology clashed with the sort of the original objectives of the war, which was to get rid of Saddam. Now, if I had to guess, what would Nixon have thought about this? I have no idea, but I'll just speculate, and I will say that I think he would have been in favor of getting rid of the regime. But I do not think he would have been in favor of trying then to impose a new government, a new regime on Iraq and the region. He would have left that up to the locals, because remember, and this morphs me into my second subject, the critical foreign policy crisis of the Nixon administration and, of course, the Johnson administration prior to it and the Ford administration after it was the Vietnam War. And in 1972, the United States was very, very anxious to make sure that we did not have to repeat what we were doing in Vietnam in other areas of the world, and therefore the Nixon Doctrine, which was essentially an effort to share the burden of regional defense, came down very strongly on the proposition that we will help friends and allies in regions that we think are important, like the Middle East, by providing them with military assistance, arms sales. We'll have a military capability, but primarily the job's up to them. And the country we chose to be the pillar of our security in the Middle East was Iran. And we were very, very friendly with the Shah of Iran. But unfortunately, the Shah of Iran was a very brittle man who did not manage his country very well. And when the Carter administration came into office in 1976, they came with a slightly different perspective on how you handle allies like Iran. The Carter administration was split between those who, what I would say, the sort of the realist pragmatists like Brzezinski, and those who were very worried about the Shah's civil rights, human rights record. In fact, it was the Carter administration was the first administration to appoint an Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights, Pat Darien. So you had this clash We want to support the Shah beats up his people and throws them in jail. And that led to it contributed to the crisis that essentially led to the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and the taking of American hostages, and the terrible relationship we've had with Iran ever since. And today, this relationship remains extraordinarily problematic for the current administration. Problematic because, on the one hand, there are very good pragmatic reasons for resolving our problems with Iran. And some scholars, some advocates talk about an Obama doing a Nixon to Iran. That is to say, like Nixon went to China in 72 and changed the whole game plan. So someone like Obama, an American president, should make the same initiative, change the game plan, make up with the Iranians because they are occupying an extremely important piece of real estate and are an important country. But of course, this goes against the emotions of Americans who remember the hostage crisis, the fact that our allies do not like this current regime in Tehran, and the fact that one of the countries that the Iranian regime now is most adamant in opposing, in fact calling for its destruction, is the State of Israel, with which we have an extremely close relationship. So my guess is that if you would try to put yourselves into a Nixonian position, it would be that while I think he would agree that Iran is a terribly important country, I do not think he would regard it as anywhere near as important as China was in 1972. And my guess is he wouldn't be taking a trip to Tehran anytime soon, and in part because of the ideology of the current Iranian regime and its attitude towards Israel, which brings me to my last point. The Arab-Israeli conflict, we all know, has been with us for many, many years. It has bedeviled every administration. It is no nearer solution than it ever was. It is a dilemma that essentially derives from the fact that while Israel does have peace with Egypt and Jordan, it is a cold peace, and that until Israel has peace with all its Arab neighbors, it will remain very vulnerable, and yet at the same time it is very strong. And Israel is a very important factor in our domestic politics. Now, it was much easier during the Cold War to essentially look at this issue through a particular perspective. During the Cold War, Israel was regarded as a strategic ally because it did have magnificent military facilities that we could have used if there'd been a war with the Soviet Union, because that was what we were mainly worried about then. Today, it's much more controversial and much more difficult because while the political support for Israel is very strong, the reality is we have huge national interests in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, and these two come into conflict with each other. The one thing that makes it somewhat less difficult for this administration is the fact that the rise of Iran and on the one hand, and Al-Qaeda and its extremism, its Sunni extremism on the other hand, has many of the so-called moderate Arab states extremely worried, and therefore they are looking to us for assistance and help and are working with us to some extent. As I look at the future agenda, the problems that this administration is going to face in the future in the Middle East, all of the above that I've mentioned are still important. We still have troops in Iraq. Iran remains on track to get a nuclear weapons program. The Israelis and the Palestinians cannot reach an agreement because their leaderships are divided. And we face these huge challenges in the future. And those challenges really come with two components. One, there is going to be further nuclear proliferation in the Middle East if we do not stop Iran. I don't know whether we can stop Iran getting nuclear weapons, But if Iran does get nuclear weapons, then so will Saudi Arabia, so will Turkey, and so will Egypt, and that will be a totally new Middle East. And the second challenge we face, of course, is economic. We have been the guardian of the Middle East, the policeman of the Gulf and the Indian Ocean, really since the early 1970s when we took over from the British, and we do not have the resources to do this forever. We have 2 wars that are unfinished. The American public is getting very, very antsy about Afghanistan. And yet, in the regions, both in the Middle East and in Asia, and my colleagues can talk more about this, there is a nervousness that the Americans might decide to pack up and leave because we've done enough. And if that happens, then they worry that countries like China might be prepared to take over. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that is a fallacy. But I do think that if you look at the challenges we face today, they are ones that require the sort of pragmatism and realism that the Nixon administration demonstrated. You see, I think Reagan would have done much the same sort of thing. And that does require a sort of a hard-headed approach because we cannot do everything. Okay.
Thank you, Geoffrey. I'd be very interested to see an Obama attempt to pull a Nixon in Iran. I was still with the government the last time we sent a delegation to Iran to negotiate with the Ayatollahs. It was during the Lebanese hostage crisis, and one of the members of the delegation told me that basically they had to run out of town for their lives because even though they were there at the request of the Iranian government, and they were up on the top floor of the old Hilton, that the extremists had found out that they were there, and that as they were going out the back door, there was a massive demonstration headed for the front door. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Our next speaker is Paul Saunders, the Executive Director of the Nixon Center. In addition to being the center's Chief Operating Officer, he directs its U.S.-Russian relations program, and he works on other issues, including energy and climate change, U.S.-European relations, the role of democracy in U.S. foreign policy. He is also Associate Publisher of the foreign policy magazine, The National Interest, published bi-monthly by the Nixon Center, and he is the publisher of National Interest Online. Paul.
Thank you very much. Jeff already mentioned how delighted we all are to be here. Please let me reiterate that. It is a real pleasure. In my particular case, it's actually my second time to come to Chapman, and I'm very happy to have had an opportunity to make a return trip. Sandy Quinn talked a little bit about the Nixon Foundation, so maybe I will give you 30 seconds about the Nixon Center just to give a little sense of who we are and what we do. We were for about 14, 15 years actually a division of the Nixon Foundation. We recently became a separate institution. We have a very close and collaborative and long relationship with the foundation. And we're really very, very pleased, like I said, all to be here. We do work, obviously, also advancing former President Nixon's legacy, but really operationalizing it and looking at some of the challenges that we face in the modern day world, and thinking about, how would we apply these kind of realist, pragmatic, Nixonian, Kissingerian principles to the world that we live in today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Russia, which is the area that I work on, and obviously the Soviet Union was certainly a very major focus of the Nixon administration's foreign policy, the competition that Jeff mentioned with the Soviet Union in the Middle East, the opening to China, which my colleague Drew Thompson works on, also an element of the competition with the Soviet Union. I'm going to talk much more about the present day and maybe take a step back a little bit when I finish. The current administration, as some may know, has been pursuing a policy toward Russia called the reset, trying to reset our relationship with Russia to start it over again, get a fresh start, improve the relationship. At the end of the previous administration, after the war in Georgia, between Russia and Georgia, the U.S.-Russia relationship really hit its lowest point, I think, arguably since not even the end of the Soviet Union, but I think probably since about 1987. It was really a very difficult time. Communication had frozen up, stopped. Rhetoric had become extremely heated. Now, the Obama administration and the reset policy has, I think, stopped that decline in the relationship and certainly improved the relationship somewhat. There have been a number of, I would say, specific accomplishments of the policy. One is that the tone is a lot better. My colleague Jeff Kemp mentioned the war in Afghanistan, and Russia is providing to the United States access through its airspace to supply American forces in Afghanistan, and is also working cooperatively with governments in Central Asia that are giving the United States similar access. That's especially important because, you know, the other main route to supply those troops, of course, is through Pakistan, and many may have noticed just over the last couple of weeks here that that's not been an entirely flawless process. So it's good to have this alternative of bringing supplies through Russia. Another accomplishment is the New START treaty. Jeff mentioned SALT and President Nixon's focus in 1972 on arms control. The new administration has signed this New START treaty, which hasn't yet been ratified by the Senate, but I think most expect it to be. And the administration has also succeeded in getting Russian support for a new round of tighter sanctions on Iran over the nuclear program. So things are certainly happening. At the same time, you know, there are really a number of challenges that are still ahead in the U.S.-Russian relationship, and I think it's far from foreordained that the current policy will succeed. And let me give you a few reasons for that. One reason is, you know, most of the things that have happened so far have really been fairly easy in the spectrum of things that we need to do with Russia. One of the things that the administration did that really markedly improved the tone was to stop pursuing NATO membership for Georgia and Ukraine and to change our planned missile defense deployments in Central Europe, a Bush administration policy. And these were both things that the Russians really hated, that the administration backed away from. But, you know, the reason that the administration backed away from those two things actually had really very little to do with Russia. Those were things that the administration wanted to do anyway. Ukraine and Georgia were never going to get into NATO anyway because none of our, well, I shouldn't say none, extremely few of our NATO allies supported that and were willing to make it happen. And of course, it's an alliance that relies on consensus. So that was basically recognition of political reality rather than a particular courageous policy step. And on missile defense, you know, it's not something that the administration, the Obama administration, was really interested in the way that the Bush administration was. So again, it was very easy for them to make changes. They were changes that they wanted to make anyway. Afghanistan, again, you know, it's an area where we have a number of common interests. Russia does not want to see Afghanistan collapse into instability, doesn't want to see the Taliban in power. Russia was supporting for years and years and years, actually together with Iran, the Northern Alliance, precisely to keep the Taliban from coming to power. The arms control agreement was also actually fairly easy. Russia was going to come down to the numbers that were agreed upon pretty much anyway, because it was too expensive for them really to keep more than that. So the question was, would the United States come down to some level like that too, or would we just let Russia do what Russia needed to do? And you know, it was not so difficult to get Russia to agree to our also making some reductions, along with reductions that they needed to make anyway. And finally, on the Iran sanctions, you know, the Russian government had already agreed, I think, to 3 previous rounds, Jeff, if I'm correct, of sanctions against Iran during the Bush administration. So this support, while important, was not something that was totally unprecedented. And I think few think that it is going to lead to any particular changes in Iran's policy. So, you know, what is it that we still need to do in the relationship with Russia? There are a lot of things, and I think some of them are really going to be quite difficult. I mentioned Iran. That's really going to be quite difficult. Russia's very resistant to tighter sanctions on Iran. At the UN General Assembly in September in New York just a few weeks ago, Russia and Brazil, India, and China, which are together called the BRIC, some may be familiar with this configuration, they were actually pressing together for a General Assembly resolution that would condemn the U.S. and European approach of imposing their own stronger sanctions that would go beyond what had been agreed in the UN Security Council, basically arguing that it wasn't right to go beyond, you know, what the international community had agreed in the Security Council, clearly suggesting, you know, that it's not going to be easy to get Russian support to do a lot more. Europe and European security. You know, the war in Georgia, I think, was illustrative of the fact that we don't have currently a European security system that Russia has really bought into. They're dissatisfied with the current security arrangements in Europe, the dominance of NATO in Europe. They feel that they should have a greater role. How are we going to resolve that problem? Are we going to try to resolve that problem? It raises a number of difficult questions. Similar questions arise in the space of the former Soviet Union, where there was really considerable competition, actually, I would say, between the United States and Russia during much of the post-Soviet period. The current administration has de-emphasized somewhat the American presence in that region, but there's still a bunch of difficult issues there. And finally, you know, there's a real problem in terms of Russian expectations, because, you know, we have our own goals as a country and our government as a government for what we want to get out of our relationship with Russia. What's it for? And the Russian government and Russian people, you know, they have their views of what they want to get out of their relationship with the United States. And there are a number of things that they want to get that it's not entirely clear they will get, or when will they get, or will they get them soon enough that they will not become disappointed before it happens. One of those is an agreement with the United States on Russian membership in the WTO. Russia really wants to resolve that agreement. It's something that they feel they have been promised a number of times and hasn't happened yet after many, many, many years of negotiations. And people in Russia feel that that's something very important for the economic development of their country and the future prosperity of their country. for the United States to be not yet reaching an agreement with Russia on bringing Russia into the WTO after so much time, it's maybe not so friendly. There's something else which not all of you may have heard of, called a 1-2-3 agreement. And for people who are familiar with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, there's a section of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, section 1-2-3, which deals with civilian nuclear cooperation. This is, selling people nuclear power plants or nuclear fuel or reprocessing fuel. Russia really wants to have a 1-2-3 agreement with the United States because they think they will be able to earn actually about $3 billion or so from commercial nuclear cooperation with the United States. They actually felt that they were promised that agreement in exchange for their decision not to deliver S-300 air defense missiles to Iran, which they would have earned about $800 million from Iran if they did that. Now, this agreement the administration submitted to the Senate in May. It doesn't require ratification. It's one of these curious things that just has to sit, in the Senate for a certain amount of time, and if they don't act, then it is approved on the basis of they're not objecting. The problem is that it has to sit there for 90 days of the Congress being in session. And curiously enough, between May and now, the Congress actually has not been in session for more than about 50 days. And this current session of Congress is going to run out before we get to the 90 days. So we're going to get to January, and the clock is going to have to start over again, assuming that the administration is willing to send it back to the Congress. After actually the Pentagon is now complaining that they didn't really get enough time to review it the first time, and they have these questions. And so I guess to be very brief, in summarizing here, you can see that there are a number of challenges moving forward in this relationship, and there are a lot of ways that it may not work out and that the reset policy may not work out. Final one thought here, is this policy a realist policy or not? A lot of people who are critics of the policy actually call it a realist policy, and that they complain that the administration is emphasizing engagement with Russia at the expense of human rights. Jeff mentioned the tension between human rights and our interests, or our values and our interests in our foreign policy. I guess, why don't I, in the interest of time, I'll leave that because I don't want to go on too long, and I'm sure people will have questions. But whether or not this is should be considered or could be considered a realist foreign policy, is that a good or bad thing to pursue a realist foreign policy? And a lot of people actually in Washington would call it a bad thing these days to pursue a realist foreign policy. I think those are some really interesting questions that really get to the heart of many of the biggest foreign policy questions that we grapple with today. So why don't I leave it there, and we'll move on to Drew.
You have to come into our classroom because some of the professors and I have this debate almost on a daily basis over lunch, realism versus idealism versus... Just to follow on something we were talking about this morning, it strikes me, listening to your presentation, that one possible solution to this is commercial diplomacy. I read with great interest that 2 weeks ago that Coyle is now negotiating to enter the Baku to Ceyhan consortium, which was specifically built to keep Central Asian oil independent of Russian oil. So perhaps some of these building blocks are already there. Our final speaker is Drew Thompson, the Director of China Studies and the Starr Senior Fellow at the Nixon Center in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining the Nixon Center, he was the National Director of the China MSD HIV/AIDS Partnership in Beijing. Mr. Thompson served previously as Assistant Director to the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He lived in Shanghai from 1993 to 1998. Mr. Thompson was the founder and chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce Transportation and Logistics Committee in Shanghai. Drew.
Thank you. And I'd also like to echo my colleagues' gratitude to Chapman University and also the Nixon Foundation for having us here. This has been a wonderful experience for us. It's also good to appreciate how far parts of this country are from Washington, because inside the Beltway we count the number of days the congressmen are in town, and actually, I mean, it really does affect everyday life. My commute changes by about 20 minutes whether or not Congress is in session every morning. So, but I mean, we're here to talk about China, and I think nowhere in the bilateral sort of relationship portfolio that the United States has with any country around the world, nowhere is President Nixon's legacy more prominent than the China relationship. I mean, it's almost impossible to think about a U.S.-China relationship without President Nixon. And I'm sure all of you out there are Star Trek fans and remember Spock telling Captain Kirk, there's an old Vulcan proverb, only Nixon could go to China. And it's true. I mean, he was a rabid anti-communist. He really was, able to crack open this relationship and lay the groundwork that every single president has followed essentially the same policy since then. So he's the foundation to the relationship. And of course, there have been a lot of changes, and primarily we see major changes in the economic relationship. I mean, China's economy has quintupled since then. It's gone from being a isolated country with, I think before in 1971 they didn't pay people in currency; they paid you in scrip. You got what were called work points. So the proletariat weren't, the workers weren't even paid in cash; they were paid in coupons. Whereas you fast forward today, it's the world's second largest economy, and what major U.S. American company doesn't have a joint venture or their own factory or at least an office there? So I mean, our economic integration is tremendous. But in other ways, we still see many of the same facets affecting the relationship, particularly in the security sphere, that President Nixon and Henry Kissinger were using to calculate their strategy back in 1971. At that time, the relationship with the Soviet Union and the conflict in Vietnam were very much critical issues that led to the decision to interact with China, to begin engagement. Today, obviously, there's no Soviet Union. The Cold War is over, but many of those issues are still on the table. I think it's important to sort of remember, again, going back to the foundation of the relationship, one of the reasons it was successful is that China wanted to engage us. This was a mutually beneficial decision. China saw itself in the 70s as basically in conflict with the two world superpowers. They had broken off their relationship with the Soviet Union in 1960. They fought an intense border war in 1969. They were fighting a proxy war with us in Vietnam at the time. They were supplying the North Vietnamese army. They had completed or essentially ended the war on the Korean Peninsula. So they saw themselves basically up against the world. And the opportunity to have a détente with the United States was quite appealing to them. And I think there's a moral to that story that today when we're addressing some of the current challenges with China, we have to find areas of mutual benefit. They are not going to do something that they don't see as being in their own benefit as much as we might want them to do it. And at the same time, it reciprocates the other way, to do things that we don't see the reason to head and do. And the result is that there are a number of challenges in the relationship that remain. a couple of the issues that are still with us today, Taiwan is still very central to the relationship. It's been a very special relationship with the United States, going back to World War II and fighting Japan and Chiang Kai-shek, and that relationship continues to this day. I mean, it's ensconced in legislation, right? The Taiwan Relations Act commits the United States to provide for Taiwan's security. The U.S. policy towards Taiwan is relatively stable. I mean, it has been since, I think, the 1980s. The U.S. wants to see a peaceful resolution of the cross-straits issue, and it has to be to the satisfaction of the Taiwanese people. Now, that frustrates many people in China who see the U.S. stance towards Taiwan as an effort to contain China or to weaken it or to somehow destabilize it. But these Cold War issues are going to probably be with us for quite some time. Now, let's speak a little bit more about Taiwan. The cross-straits relationship between China and Taiwan are improving dramatically in the last 2 years. And since President Obama took office, we've seen a U.S.-China relationship in some ways defined by Taiwan. I mean, in other ways, it doesn't seem to be Taiwan-driven, but underneath it, it really still is. At the very beginning of the administration taking office, 2008, the relationship was very warm, but they hadn't really dealt with the Taiwan issue. They put that off. They wanted to first build a rapport with the Chinese leadership after they came into office. They did that, but by the end of 2009, the administration notified Congress of their intent to sell an arms package to Taiwan, number of defensive weapons, including Patriot missiles and anti-submarine warfare aircraft. And China responded very negatively, as you can imagine. They cut off military relations, all military contacts with the United States. The rhetoric was rather intense. And then for the better part of this year, the relationship between China and the U.S. has been rather strained. We've had economic tensions. There's been frustration here in the U.S. over the trade deficit, over the value of RMB currency, over market access, indigenous innovation policies that discriminate against U.S. policies, essentially Chinese mercantilist practices in other countries. And this frustration in the trade sector is very much linked to security sector frustrations. And in September of this year, we started to see the relationship noticeably improve. Through some active diplomacy, the White House sent emissaries to meet with the senior Chinese leadership. They were received warmly. The team from the White House that went to visit Beijing were met by President Hu Jintao. They were met by the premier. They got to meet everybody. They were fed the most most wonderful banquets. They were toasted. They were told, we really want this to get better. And then they said, and President Hu Jintao would like to accept the invitation to come visit Washington later this year. So that started a series of agendas rolling. The military-to-military relationship was restarted in September. And now we've got talks planned between the Department of Defense and the Chinese military. Secretary Gates met with his Chinese counterpart, the Chinese Defense Minister Liang Guanlie in Hanoi last week. He's agreed to go visit. So we're starting to see the bilateral relationship essentially pick up again. They've gotten over some of the tensions of the previous, sort of the first half of the first term of the administration. We've also seen some other sort of boogeymen of the Cold War that just won't go away, and I'm thinking about North Korea. They are a perpetual challenge to this administration, but they've come up with a fairly innovative strategy to essentially ignore them. And that, it turns out to be the one strategy that hadn't been tried before, yet it seems to be the most effective thus far. The administration has simply not risen to the bait. They've not gotten worked up. They've decided to let North Korea, sure, go ahead. We think you may have 5 nuclear weapons. Test a few more. Launch your missiles into the sea. Deplete your resources. They're going to maintain the pressure on them. They're going to keep up the sanctions. Now, we started out thinking about the Cold War, and inherent to this relation is the alliance structure that the U.S. has in the Pacific region, which is really a legacy of the Cold War, but is the foundation, again, of our regional security strategy. The U.S.-Japan relationship and the U.S.-South Korean relationships are sort of bedrocks of our diplomacy in the region. The U.S.-Korea relationship is quite strong. We saw that after the Cheonan incident this March, where North Korea sank a South Korean Navy vessel, killing 46 sailors. The South Korean Navy determined that it was, or the South Korean government determined that it was a North Korean torpedo fired from a midget submarine that sank the ship. And the U.S. has walked very much in lockstep with the South Korean leadership since then. And the relationship has been described by many people in Seoul as the best it's ever been. The Japanese relationship has also been improving. There have been some challenges, much of it due to Japanese internal politics. I'm not going to get into that. I'm not even sure I fully understand it. Most Japan experts you talk to don't fully understand it. There's a lot of internal competition within the various parties. But the Japanese relationship is improving with the U.S. On top of this, you've got a growing and improving and strengthening relationship between the U.S. and Southeast Asian countries. And Vietnam has been particularly visible lately. Much of the region is responding to China's rise. They're responding to a much more assertive China, China that's increasingly recognizing that it has international interests that it didn't have before, primarily economic. They have great insecurities about some of those economic interests. My colleague Jeff Kemp has worked extensively on issues related to Chinese access to energy in the Indian Ocean and sea lanes of control. And the Chinese mentality here is that this dependence on world markets for energy and as an outlet for its exports is one of uncertainty, and there's a certain feeling of vulnerability here. But that said, they are dependent, and they recognize that, and they're changing their policies, and we're not quite sure how, and they're still sort of feeling their way through it. The issue is it's scaring the neighbors. We're seeing a classic security dilemma forming. China's military has been modernizing and increasing its budgets, going up % every year since '99. So you've had a decade of rapid military growth. You've had growing capabilities and concerns about the PLA being more assertive. We've seen a number of incidents in the waters around Taiwan where Chinese military or civilian military, like maritime fisheries, Coast Guard vessels being provocative towards U.S. and Japanese vessels, and that's raising concern. And we have essentially at the heart of that some irredentist concerns about who owns the South China Sea. And of course, China claims most of it, but there's a lot of disputed territory in the maritime domain. And Vietnam, Japan, and South Korea to some extent, all are very concerned about China's growing capabilities and their growing assertiveness. And the result is they're turning to the United States. And the United States is responding. And we're responding in a way I think is fairly predictable and also greatly appreciated. The U.S. is strengthening its alliances. It's attending meetings. We keep hearing the U.S. policy towards Southeast Asia is we're back. But that's a bit disingenuous because we never really left. But there was a perception in the region that the U.S. commitment was lessening. And I think that's something this administration has been trying very hard to correct and to assure our friends and allies in the region that the United States is very much committed to maintaining its presence, not just as a hedge against China, but as a symbol of our core values. Our interest is in maintaining these relationships, not at China's expense, but to really help maintain the peace and prosperity of the region.
Thank you, Joe. It's an interesting reminder. The parties in South Asia that are now balancing against China bring to mind why Nixon was interested in China in the first place. It wasn't that he was interested so much in China per se, as he wanted to balance against Russia. And so here we see the exact same balancing activity taking place again. I had a friend of mine who in 1980 got in an elevator in New York City and found that he was sharing the elevator with Richard Nixon. And in order to just make some conversation, he said, "Oh, Mr. President, I'm a great admirer of the way you established diplomatic relations with China." And Nixon turned on him and he said, "I never did that. I never did it. That was Carter. I never wanted it to go that far. So balancing is important. All right, at this point, we'll open things up to questions and answers. Professor Will.
Yes,
Just we have a mic.
I have a question that I'd like to direct to Geoffrey Kemp, in part because of the region, and in part because he and I are both in the handful of people in the room old enough to remember the events. I want to get at the issue of what would be the Nixonian approach to Afghanistan, and I would look back to Vietnam, and I recall Frank Snep's book, Decent Interval. Snep was the last CIA station chief there, who was very critical of how we got out. And to follow the Nixon model, would Obama get Dr. Kissinger or the 21st century variation of him, maybe Secretary Clinton, and make arrangements in Afghanistan for a U.S. exit that would leave a caretaker government in place that 2 years hence might cut a deal with the Taliban, and that would be the end of it. I mean, Karzai's already making noises to that effect. Is that a course we might see?
Well, I think that's a terrific question, and I think it is probably the most challenging single issue that Obama is going to face in the coming months, because on the one hand, he has made a formal commitment to start withdrawing troops from Afghanistan in July 2011, but has been extremely coy about what that actually means. I mean, three soldiers come out, or do 3,000? Now, if you sort of think about this in a sort of Nixonian terms, I think Nixon, after something like 9/11, would have clobbered Afghanistan, which is what, and that was, we got rid of the Taliban. Now, my personal view is today, I think that any American president would be traumatized by the dilemma we face, not so much because of Afghanistan, but because of Pakistan. Pakistan is really a serious country, 170 million, more than Russia, nuclear weapons, chaos. It's sitting, right across from the most valuable energy resources in the world. If Pakistan were stable, if they were reliable, if they were working out an agreement with India to solve Kashmir, I think we'd be out of Afghanistan. I really do. But I think I think the dilemma today is that if we were to somehow walk away from Afghanistan before there is some semblance of stability, I think it would have a tragic impact on Pakistan. Now, it may not be enough anyway to save Pakistan, but I think that's the dilemma that Obama and his advisors are struggling with every day, including General Petraeus.
I invite you to stay for the student panels at 3:30, because one of the presentations is the Vietnamization of Afghanistan. Another question. Yes, sir.
Mr. Thompson, in regards to the current trade war that seems to be brewing, throughout, what do you think China's reaction will be to there's talk in Congress about legislation putting pressure on China? Given China's recent reaction, say with the rare earths embargo on Japan, what do you think their reaction will be to some kind of legislation aimed at China?
Well, actually, the legislation's already passed the House. And the question is, will the Senate pick it up? And that's, again, a parlor talk in Washington. Do they have enough days left in the agenda and whatnot? So, there's technical issues to whether it'll come about. And a number of congressmen have really led the charge on that. I think it's pretty clear, China's very much against it. They'll think of ways to retaliate. They've been cautious, though, and not revealed their hand. But I think retaliation is a better word than simply responding. That said, it's a little difficult to determine how they would respond. Essentially, this is a sovereignty issue. It's their currency. We can't dictate the value of their currency any more than they can dictate, our monetary policy. I think, however, it'd be likely that a U.S. response that, for instance, included duty rates, increased duties on Chinese imports, would be met by similar increases on the Chinese side, and they're fairly good at measured responses. I mean, one of the, I guess, if there's a piece of hope to cling to, is that we don't have a major problem with China in terms of managing escalation on the economic front. They are very, very cognizant of the codependencies in our economic relationship. So they're not going to break it off. They're not going to, impose something that you might say is unexpected. If the U.S. reacts in one way, they'll react in a similar and rather, measured way as well. They're not going to overreact, if you will. Whereas on the security side of the relationship, that is a greater concern. There's much more internal debate within China. There's different factions that see the world very differently. And when you do have these sorts of conflicts arise, in for instance, I mean, it can be as tactical as just two ships bumping or two airplanes bumping. Managing that escalation can be quite challenging. But that said, there's a lot of mechanisms in the U.S.-China bilateral relationship that exist to manage the relationship. You've got the strategic and economic dialogue. You've got it's called the JCCT, the Joint Committee on Commerce and Trade. There's a lot of regular government-to-government interaction on the commercial issues that help them keep it on a steady course and really sort of pursue American interests effectively.
Again, the question for Mr. Thompson. You just stated that China is aware of their economic codependency with the U.S., but also, like, during your lecture, you mentioned that a lot of the neighbors around China who are allies of the U.S. are turning to the U.S. because they're concerned regarding the growing military power and economic power of China. I wonder, given the fact that a lot of U.S. debt is held by the Chinese, if that would sort of turn off the U.S. from actually sort of giving an extra hand to their allies and give China the actual comparative advantage in that little political relationship.
I don't know how long I have to respond. We could have a whole other panel on this issue. I don't think the treasuries are a very good point of leverage. I mean, there's that old saying, right? If you borrow $1 million from the bank owns you. You borrow $100 million, you now own the bank. It doesn't work that way. I mean, China is a large holder, but if you look at the entire, outstanding U.S. deficit, that's in treasuries that are held around the world, I think China, I don't know the exact statistics, and the Treasury Department doesn't put them out fairly often, but it's something like 10%. So it's not like they own it all. The Japanese own a large chunk. The Saudis own a large chunk. Individuals, corporations, it's widely held. So I don't think China has a great deal of leverage. Now, there have been a couple of commentators in China. I wouldn't characterize them as economists. They're, in fact, military officers who've said they should use China's holdings of treasuries as an economic weapon and just dump them on the market. But, I mean, that's really not it's an empty threat. It wouldn't work, because what would happen is it would basically upset the renminbi's value, it would harm the U.S. currency, and it would further strengthen this currency imbalance. Just to go back to currency really quickly, that's a very much sort of, if you Washington issue. Most economists don't think that the value of the renminbi is really the cause of our trade deficit. It's a number of factors, and obviously it would have some impact on balancing trade, but it wouldn't do much to create jobs in the United States. I think that's a bit of a misnomer, and in fact, the U.S.-China Business Council produces a CD which shows every single congressional district and how much in exports they have to China every year and what the number of jobs that are created, and then they can also show how shifting the renminbi might actually harm some of those exports because of the way the U.S.-China relationship is structured. And again, a lot of the exports from China that come to the United States are products made by U.S. companies with factories in China. So the renminbi valuation at the moment benefits them very much.
Time for one last question.
For Drew Thompson, I confess this is a bit of a curveball. noticing your connection with the Chamber of Commerce in China, do you find it likely that monies from the Chinese government or Chinese enterprises could find their ways into the coffers of the Chamber of Commerce and then, being fungible, support some chamber activities that would free up other monies to be used, as the president suggests, in smear attacks on Democrats?
I mean, obviously, there's no evidence either way, and you know, the core problem or the core issue is the transparency of the process and the advertising laws that that the Supreme Court ruled on. But I'll make this observation. I don't think China's been a terribly effective lobbyist in Washington in the past. They do not have committed resource funds to shape the Washington policy environment. I think they have one or two consulting firms on retainer to help them with lobbying, but they're very small contracts. If you talk to those lobbyists, they're canceled at the end of a quarter, and they're not taken up until there's a problem later. So they don't have a consistent strategy. And if you don't have a strategy, you don't have the resources. I mean, this is true in the U.S. government as well. So if you look in the past where they might have used money to meddle in politics, it's been done through third parties and proxies. And I mean, again, historically, China has used the business community as its lobby. When they weren't happy with something, they called in the CEOs or the presidents in China of the different companies, the major companies, always Motorola, AT&T, it was the big names. They call them in and say, we're not happy with what the Clinton administration is doing, and Charlene Barshevsky, the USTR, is giving us these 301 challenges, and we're not happy. You go back to your country and you tell them to stop. And they were effectively the China lobby. That's changing a bit. They're a little more reluctant to do it, but they're putting money into the process, so they influence it. So their interests are being heard, and if their interests are in further engagement with China, it will have an impact. But honestly, I don't think the Chinese government has the resources or the strategy or even the will to contribute to U.S. campaign efforts.
And you thought we didn't follow inside the Beltway politics, huh?
Oh, well, I forget you get NPR out here too, right?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming today and participating in this panel with us. We invite you to stay around. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and then at 3:30 we're going to hear from 3 of our Chapman students who are going to give presentations on the Nixon legacy and receive feedback from our panel of experts. So thank you once again.